We are back. I hope you had a great lunch. I hope you managed to enjoy what is the most spectacular spring day in the middle of winter. But I'm sure you appreciate the sunshine nonetheless. Well, the UN Charter starts with those famous words, "We the peoples." Although it could be argued that they may as well start with the words, "We the governments." People do not have a directly elected voice, of course, being represented by the governments at the United Nations. But what if you didn't necessarily have a government representative, but one elected directly by people to serve your interests at the United Nations? A UN Parliamentary Assembly would make this idea a reality. Now, the idea is not new. It's been floated around the founding of the League of Nations back in the 20s and the establishment of the United Nations itself in the 1940s. In 2007, a campaign was launched to advocate for such an assembly. And the Commission on Global Security, Justice and Governance also endorsed the idea. That committee, obviously, chaired by Madeleine Albright and former Nigerian Foreign Minister Ibrahim Gambari. So it certainly has some advocates. To talk to this question, we've invited our next speaker, an academic, formerly staff reporter for the Associated Press in Washington, an academic who's focused his career on interstate politics and diplomacy, Vice President of Academic Stand Against Poverty, Associate Professor now at Griffith University. Would you please welcome to the stage Luis Cabrera.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the organizers for bringing me down here from Brisbane, and I'd like to say good afternoon, global citizens. I spent a lot of time working on issues of global citizenship. My last book was essentially about that. And so I'm really pleased to be able to come down here and speak to an audience of people who are within an association that's as close to a concrete global citizenship as many of us can often get. So I'd like to talk today about something I was initially skeptical about. In fact, I was commissioned to write that report for Madeleine Albright and Ibrahim Gambari's commission. So they were going to look at the kinds of global governance reforms that are needed to make the current global governance system fit for moral purpose or fit for governance purpose as we move into our new age. And so I'm especially interested to see the theme here is making the United Nations fit for purpose. So I was, as I say, I was skeptical initially when they asked me to write about a UN Parliamentary Assembly because in writing various things about global citizenship, about global ethics, global justice, my thought had always been that right now might be a little premature to be talking about a UN Parliamentary Assembly. It might simply be to put the cart before the horse, as it were, where we should be talking about ways to strengthen human rights protection, ways to work on regional integration, which might feed into various forms of beneficial global integration. So I approached the subject as a skeptic. By the time I was finished writing the paper, I was very much converted. So I will attempt to show you my journey here today and see if it persuades you. So, what I'd like to talk about is whether the UN or whether the Interparliamentary Union is fit for the role it's playing of the United Nations parliamentary dimension. I'll explain what precisely is meant by a parliamentary dimension. Whether a standing, initially consultative UN Parliamentary Assembly would be a better option, with the IPU serving as a complementary institution, and whether a key interim step toward developing the standing parliamentary body could be the creation of a parliamentary network on the United Nations. And I'll give the game away. The answer I'm going to offer to each of those three is yes. So I'll talk first about, I'll give some background on the idea of a global parliamentary dimension. It's been around a while. I'll offer some models of a parliamentary dimension and the specific case for a UN Parliamentary Assembly. Talk about some objections to the assembly idea. There are some that certainly need to be taken into consideration. And then talk about possible next steps. And if you'd like to see the full paper, if you just Google my name and look at the UN Parliamentary Assembly, it'll come up as a free PDF. The Commission on Global Governance Reform that Madam Albright headed has a large and very useful website with a lot of these background papers that went into the recommendations. So what is a parliamentary assembly? It has three primary roles. At least this is the way we often speak of a parliamentary assembly. I think this is the way I think about it. Representation, it represents the people of a polity. Oversight, it oversees what the government or administration is doing, what the executive arm of the governing bodies are doing. And legislation, it often will have the power to initiate and pass binding legislation. So what then would be a parliamentary dimension? Well, beyond the state, this is usually what we're talking about. There are only rare cases, the European Parliament being the clearest example, although it doesn't have all of those powers that were mentioned. It doesn't have the power to initiate legislation. But beyond the state, we're usually talking about a parliamentary dimension, not a physical, concrete parliamentary assembly. And this is usually dialogue between parliamentary representatives in the various states, efforts by them to exercise influence over the executives who are meeting and negotiating within the World Trade Organization, within the United Nations, whatever it might be, to set binding rules upon themselves. A parliamentary dimension in this context means national parliamentarians are actually going to where the executive delegates are, the people appointed by the executive branch, and trying to influence, trying to exercise that oversight, trying to get their voice heard and represent their constituents. Okay? So that's how it usually happens in governance processes beyond the nation state. There's a lot of this that goes on, as I'll show you in a second. But there are two basic kinds of parliamentary dimensions that I want to talk about. One is the one I just mentioned, and one is the more formal one. So we have international parliamentary organizations, and many of these are standing bodies. I'll name some in just a moment. They're composed of representatives serving again in their national legislatures, their national parliaments, meeting with their counterparts as part of an official delegation from their body to an international forum. The Interparliamentary Union is probably the clearest example of that. And then you have supra-state parliamentary bodies. These are parliamentarians who are attached to actually the supra-state body. The European Union is probably the clearest example. The European Parliament is attached to it. They're not national representatives. They're not national parliamentarians coming to an international forum. They're actually elected to represent constituents at the international forum and to exercise oversight over them. So, by way of background, the Interparliamentary Union is very old. In fact, a lot older than many people realize. 1889, it was founded by two European peace activists. They said, we feel like democracy has brought some benefits domestically to the few countries where it's actually practiced. We'd like to extend that. We'd like to extend those democratic representative roles internationally as far as possible. And it made some early contributions. The two Hague Peace Conferences, 1899 and 1907. The IPU was central there. The IPU was actually very important. World War I, as it did for so many, took it a bit by surprise. It was marginalized. And by the time the League of Nations was being drawn up, the Interparliamentary Union was not part of it. There were some proposals made for a global parliamentary assembly that would actually have pretty significant powers to become part of the League of Nations. That was not finally accepted, but there was some support for that. The Interparliamentary Union was on the sidelines. That continued through World War II. We didn't hear much from the Interparliamentary Union around World War II. Even after World War II, in the heyday of world government, you may not, I don't think this is widely taught in schools, but in fact in the 1940s, especially after Hiroshima, hundreds of thousands of people in countries around the world were coming out very vigorously in favor of not a United Nations, not an international organization, but actually a genuinely global organization, turning it into something like a world government with binding powers. There were a lot of those kind of proposals, notably, including from Albert Einstein and other people. Notably, they did not include the Interparliamentary Union. It was again an afterthought. Now, since World War II, we've seen a veritable explosion in these. There are far more than 100 now, interparliamentary assemblies. It began with the Consultative Assembly of the Council of Europe, which is best known for the European Human Rights Convention. The NATO Parliamentary Assembly was formed not long after. In the decades since, we've seen the rise of such entities as the Arab Interparliamentary Union, the Parliamentary Network on the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, and scores more. Again, these are national parliamentarians elected to serve in their national parliaments, going to try to influence what's happening at an international body, an intergovernmental organization. And then you've also seen the rise of formal parliamentary assemblies beyond the states. So again, the European Parliament, but also Parlisur in Latin America, the Central American Parliament, the African Union Parliament. Many of these are in their infancy, but significant commitments and resources have been made and dedicated to developing this. So both Parlisur and the African Union Parliament have committed to direct election of delegates within the next few years and to an actual strong policy-making role for those assemblies in the decades to come. So, the IPU has come back on the scene. It's marginalized for most of the century, I would say. In the late 1990s, mid-1990s, it had some sort of vigorous leadership, and they said, look, we think we need to be a lot more integrally incorporated into the United Nations, into the governance exercised by the United Nations. So it's now got 170 members. Australia is a member. The United States is not been since 1999. Claims to represent a parliamentary dimension for the United States. If you read on their website, that's a very prominent claim. I think it's right on the homepage when you know about us. We serve as the parliamentary dimension for the United Nations. And they're able to claim that, in part because in 2002, due to the efforts of some vigorous officials within their organization who reached out to the UN, they were granted permanent observer status. That means they're able to circulate all the documents they want to circulate. It means the General Assembly, they've got a permanent delegate to the United Nations General Assembly who can be there on the floor, making sure that they're heard. They hold conferences alongside the annual autumn meeting of the General Assembly. It does not support a UN Parliamentary Assembly. That's been discussed in the IPU. The then president at the time said, you know, we asked people about it. No one was interested in doing this. We don't support this. So that's where we're at. And there's the current president. Okay, UN Parliament campaigns. As was mentioned, these are not new. In recent years, two of the most prominent ones have been the Infuser campaign, the International Network for the UN Second Assembly. And the idea is we still have the General Assembly. That's an assembly which represents the voice of states, and in fact represents the voice of the executive, because it's the executive, it's the government which appoints the delegate to the United Nations. The delegate takes marching orders from the government. The idea of the Second Assembly is it would be more directly the voice of the people, the voice of the people's elected representatives. And I know there are a lot of non-democracies too. But that's what these campaigns have tried to promote. And in fact, the Infuser campaign was even a little more radical than that in some ways, because they wanted not necessarily national parliamentarians to be their representatives, but grassroots representatives from NGOs or other organizations. So they called for a consultative parliament with a mandate to give greater voice to global civil society. That was expressly the word. It was like these representatives from that sector, not for the domestic parliament. They got some attention. They had very large conferences in New York, Vienna, San Francisco, and more than 100 national and international NGOs signed on, had the ear of some high-level UN officials. But the proposals ultimately were not taken up. There's a lot of resistance from powerful states within the UN to this kind of idea. That campaign gradually dissolved. In about 2007, this campaign replaced it. This campaign emerged, Campaign for a United Nations Parliamentary Assembly. And if you will, this has been more, I don't like to use the word, but more elite focused, elite in the social science sense of looking at elected representatives, people who hold sort of high-level official positions of power. And what they've been trying to do, instead of primarily trying to get the NGO support, they've been trying to work from the other direction and try to get national parliamentarians to sign on. And they've done pretty well at it, I would say. They've had 1,400 national and regional parliamentarians from the European Parliament from more than 100 countries sign on to it. Now, I'll just note that the United States, they've had probably their least success in the United States for various reasons. They've only had maybe out of 4, but really not very many. If you look at Germany, I think they've got more than 100 in Germany. So it varies by country, but that's been their strategy. They've got support from the UN Special Rapporteur on Democracy, the European Parliament in March, the African Union Parliament issued a statement that this effort should be supported. So they've actually, I think, generated some pretty good momentum. So the question then becomes, how should the UN parliamentary dimension be filled? The Interparliamentary Union is very clear that it is the parliamentary dimension. That is the mantle it has claimed for itself. Is that the right answer? So I think to answer this question, you have to step back a little bit to what democracy is for. Why do we support democracy? What do we expect democracy to do for people? Right? Now, I think we probably don't spend a lot of time thinking about that in our day-to-day lives. We spend an awful lot of time thinking about that in the democratic theory literature. And there are two primary answers. That's a gross simplification, but two approaches in which democracy arguments tend to fall. Because if you think about it, democracy is kind of a strange way to do your business. You know, we tell ourselves that we're free beings, and then we tell ourselves that the 51% majority gets to decide for the rest of us, gets to bind the rest of us. So it's a little bit strange when you think about democracy. So why is it the final answer? Why is it the answer that most people in the world actually seem to accept? Not everyone, but most people. Well, there's one approach, I'll call it the respect approach, that says democracy does enable autonomy for all individuals. It does enable us to be free because it enables us to lead self-chosen lives, or at least lives where we've got a voice in how we're going to be governed. One of the challenges that's often raised to that justification for democracy, that justification for doing collective rule in this way, is that you've got the problem of persistent minorities. If you happen to be, so I'll use an example that probably won't offend anybody in the room because it's from Arizona in the United States, but in the city where I used to live, Phoenix, Arizona, there are almost no Democrats. I think there was my family and 5 other Democrats. So we were a persistent minority. We were never going to win an election. That's an exaggeration. We were never going to win an election. So democracy for us, yes, it was an exercise in voice, it was an exercise in let's go out and vote, but we know that in our district, the 2nd Congressional District of Arizona, we're never going to win. We are a persistent minority. So democracy may do many good things. You know, it enables you to write to your representative, to be responded to have a voice, that sort of thing. But it doesn't necessarily make you free if by being free what we mean is a self-chosen life. So I've taken that issue pretty seriously in my work, and I tend to fall on the side of the protect approaches, which says that democracy is simply one of many tools that can be used to protect and promote individual rights protections. And so I think the answer to the question, which would be the appropriate UN parliamentary dimension, probably comes down to, well, which would be the best, the most promising for promoting rights protections. And when I really started thinking about it, this is what persuaded me that UNPA was probably the right answer in the long term. But let's look at the cases. So in fact, there are 3 possible parliamentary dimensions that have gotten quite a lot of attention. You know, big articles in Foreign Affairs. John McCain, the former presidential candidate for the U.S., leading a big, trying to start a movement for alliance of democracies. These have all gotten quite a lot of attention. So, consolidating role of the Interparliamentary Union within the United Nations, more photo ops with the UN Secretary General, more integral to UN governance. Creating an independent world parliamentary body, possibly through an initial treaty involving current democracies, and that was McCain's. The idea that McCain was promoting, or launching a UN Parliamentary Assembly. So, what about the IPU option? Well, one concern that many people have raised is the IPU is primarily national orientation of IPU parliamentarians. And there are some delegates to an IPU meeting. They bring their national concerns to an international forum, but what they're talking about in the hallways are their national concerns. What concerns their country? Global issues are typically framed as foreign policy, multilateral relations. They don't take it upon themselves to oversee the UN itself. They don't spend a lot of time parsing, peacekeeping and security operations in the way that was done in a very sophisticated manner this morning. That's not what the IPU sees as its primary role. Also, they're playing practical time constraints. They're very busy people, so to expect them to play this role on a standing, perpetual basis would be difficult, I think. So what about an independent global parliament? There's Richard Falk, who's been writing about these kinds of ideas for a very long time, has come up with probably the most fully elaborated, let's say, proposal for this alliance of democracies. He says, look, non-democracies are a problem. It's going to be almost a non-starter if we try to bring in all the non-democracies. Let's just start with the countries which say they cherish democratic values. Let's ask them to put their money and their resources where their mouth is and sign a treaty. Sign a treaty for an alliance of the democracies which would aim at giving greater representation, greater voice to global civil society, to people within states. It wouldn't initially be a UN Parliamentary Assembly. He likes the idea of a second assembly, but he says we're nowhere near there. Let's start with this alliance of the democracies. One of the immediate problems, though, is it can be asked whether it's fair to exclude those in non-democracies. So a UN Parliamentary Assembly, its proponents will say, could offer proxy representatives in the extreme case, in the case of a regime that simply doesn't want to hear from the opposition. I won't name any names, but there are many countries we can think about. And could at least offer a platform to the domestic opposition. Many countries are very good at ensuring that their opposition doesn't have much voice, doesn't have much funding. They're very good at targeting the overseas funding, saying it's outside agitators subverting the national democracy, that sort of thing. This at least would offer a platform to the domestic opposition in a way that the sort of echo chamber that the Alliance of Democracies might be would not. And it also, if it's a UN Parliamentary Assembly, would attach the oversight role of the body trying to exercise that oversight role to the organization, or the set of organizations really in the United Nations that we have that exercises the greatest governance power in the world today. If you look at the UN, all of its affiliated agencies, and we're not even include the World Trade Organization, the World Bank, etc. There are a lot of power centers of global governance there. And if you try to create a wholly separate global parliament, the way that George Monbiot, the well-known Guardian columnist in the UK, has argued in the book-length treatment, a very sophisticated argument, but this is what he came up with in the end. He really likes the World Social Forum. He wants it to be a grassroots thing because it would have legitimacy. But the problem is, it would not necessarily be having traction when it came to actually exercising that oversight role, exercising the accountability role that parliaments typically do. So I would say, after considering this and after initially coming in skeptically, the UNPA option probably offers the best option for promoting rights protections within the organization, through the organization, for promoting oversight, for promoting representation over much time, over much time. And I'll come back to it. So even if it's only consultative in the near term, and that's what they presume, you could play a continuous oversight role in security and other matters, especially if you're involved in the living system. So it would be a standing there with a voice, we're able to call the news conference, able to call further attention to things that it thinks are going wrong within the UN system. And I'll offer an example of, so here's an example. So it could provide some voice to those excluded, like current procedures, for example, for giving human rights testimony. So there's a procedure by which states can offer anonymous objections. So if your group is the subject of an anonymous objection, you don't get the platform, you don't get the microphone, you don't get to speak in particular human rights forums in New York. A UNPA could offer that platform. It wouldn't be the same, but it would be a platform. It would be in New York. It would be in the second chamber, presuming it could ever get off the ground. And it could also promote a stakeholder identity, global citizenship. It would give ideals of global citizenship, something very concrete to attach to it. And I don't think we should undersell that. I don't think we should undersell that's the importance of a sense of global identity, even if only in its infant form, being able to be attached to this body that is there to represent your interests, whose whole purpose in the world is to represent your interests, especially move this day over time towards elections. Now, that's a lot of if and hopefully and maybe over time. So let's look at some of the objections before we get to some of the possibilities for developing such a thing. So one that's often brought up is the idea that we have global tyranny of the majority. The global majority would eat the rich. You know, based on the latest speaking advice, and I know I'm making some assumptions about it, so I apologize if this doesn't apply to you, but probably we all are in the 1%. Even if you're a PhD student or a master's student, you're probably in the global 1% of income, because the income distribution tail is very, very, very long. I was just looking this up so I could speak knowledgeably about it. And I was dismayed to find out that I am comfortably in the 1%, probably even more than that. And everyone probably who is able to attend a large university in a relatively rich country is also going to be in the 1%. So that puts us all in there. There aren't that many people in the world who are that rich. So does the giant global majority of people who aren't that rich eat the rich? Well, if democracy worked the way plutocrats and autocrats have always feared it would, yes, that would happen. But it's not usually the way it happens. So I think that objection is not the killing you. I don't think that that is reason for anyone to say that the UN parliamentary assembly is not a good idea. Because if you look at existing domestic systems especially, they tend to have veto points, uneven representation that reflects past compromises among powerful groups. This is the way democracy is done for the most part. Most proposals for UN Assembly presume that some form of weighted voting would be necessary to launch the file. Many observers would say that without the vetoes on the Security Council, we don't have a Security Council, possibly we don't have a functioning United Nations, etc., etc. It would be that kind of idea. I'm not necessarily saying that's the case, but it's that kind of thinking. It does raise fairness issues. Absolutely, it raises fairness issues. I spent a lot of time in India, and if you tell India that Norway, or Germany is going to have as many votes as India does, with its 80 million people compared to 1.3 million people, fairness flags immediately are raised, as well they should be. So over time, those kinds of pressures, I think, will become acute. And I think as the body developed, as the global system developed, we would see a lot of pressure toward more equal representation. But I think in the beginning, probably this is not a killing objection. What about non-democracies? This is a very practical objection. So electoral democracies are shown here in blue. There are about 122 electoral democracies according to Freedom House. And, you might want to challenge that, but it's a fairly widely accepted analysis. They do it every year. So you can see the ones that are not counted electoral democracies. All of those states would be, under the current proposals, part of a UN parliamentary assembly. Now, the common objection is, well, these 37% of states which are non-democracies, would they just be puppets appointed by the regime? And you have to say possible. But again, the UNPA could at least provide additional voice and oversight opportunities and the ability to challenge those appointed representatives. Working with the Interparliamentary Union, I do think there's a role for the Interparliamentary Union. It could help to promote and consolidate democratization. The IPU does a lot of really impressive work on consolidation of democratization, on support, on sharing knowledge and best practices, on sending delegations here and there. Okay, possible next steps. What does this all look like on the ground today, July 23rd, 2016? What could we do as global citizens, July 24th? Well, the IPU, again, rejects the idea of the UNPA. So probably few near-term possibilities for collaboration there. The UNPA would probably have to get off the ground in a pretty significant way before the IPU would come knocking. I think it would. But an initial step would be the creation of a global interparliamentary network for the United Nations. And I'm even trotting out a pretty bad acronym for it. But Interparliamentary Network United Nations. Unlike the Interparliamentary Union, members will be focused specifically on governance within the United Nations system, and that kind of oversight. And they seek to further develop the parliamentary dimension to promoting transparency, oversight, and accountability within the system. Not a new idea. As I mentioned before, There are lots of these things out there. So it could be very informal at first. In fact, there's already essentially a Friends of the UN network from globally oriented national parliamentarians who get together themselves already at UN meetings. And these could be people interested in serving as Friends of the UN. Now, I didn't mention it, but Andres Gomel, that nice-looking young man in the campaign for UNPA slide, his photo, he's the head of the campaign. And he was up in Brisbane for a workshop we had on some of these ideas recently. And we talked about this, and he actually likes the idea of Friends of the UN. So we're batting around some things with other people who are interested in this, and please approach me after if you want to be part of this dialogue, and seeing who might just want to be the first group of Friends of the UN among parliamentarians. This can be formalized over time, and that would be similar, very similar to the development of the Interparliamentary Network on the WTO and the World Bank. So these are parliamentarians who meet alongside the ministerial meetings, let's say the WTO, every time it meets, and they attempt to give input. The WTO often doesn't want to hear it, but the Director General will come over and give a talk and have a dialogue. So at least there's something going on there. And I think it would be relatively easy to see this formalized over time. And this could provide an important means of publicizing the case for a standing assembly, for a more concrete, actual parliamentary assembly, a second chamber there on 53rd Street in New York, and garnering further support for it, as well as highlighting ways in which the UNPA could operate as a fundamentally global level complement to the more domestically oriented IPU. You can imagine these two developing together. Now, there are challenges. There are big challenges. In November, if on November 6th, this man is Mr. President, that's going to be a very big challenge. The New York Times says there's only a 25% chance that happens in the Electoral College, so maybe they've done their math right. But bringing more and larger INGOs on board the UNPA campaign, so they've worked with the parliamentarians, they've worked with the leaders. Now they'd like to do a lot more work with the amnesties of the world, the human rights watches of the world. They realize they need to do that, and they're looking for ways to make that happen. They also need to get support among members of the U.S. Congress administration, because the U.S. still pays more than 20% of all UN dues. It throws its weight around quite significantly in that organization, and you would have to get buy-in from the U.S. The good news is Madeleine Albright, people take her phone calls still in the Democratic administration. So if it's Madeleine Clinton who's president, then it's just possible that this idea might get something of a hearing in the U.S. It might be able to gain a little bit of traction. It's not a particularly good time today for democracy in the world. It's not a particularly good time today for supranationalism, but these pendulums swing back and forth. And I think there's a struggle to be had here. It would be harder if that gentleman is the president, but I think the struggle is pretty clear before us, and that's one of the challenges that we have to deal with. Okay, so in sum, last slide. A UN Parliamentary Assembly would be better suited to play traditional oversight, accountability, and in the very long-term legislative roles, we could foresee that, than the IPU. And when I say very long-term, I'm talking about decades and decades and decades, 100 years. In global terms, that's not that long, really. You look at the development of the species and our political development over the last several thousand years. An important first step would be the creation of a global network of parliamentarians, again, my friends of the UN, that could become a formal network, formalized over time, strengthen and publicize the case for UNPA, be a body that meets periodically and says, hey, this is a great idea. Individuals, and here's where we get to global citizens. Within UN member states, we have crucial global citizen roles to play in promoting the idea in universities, schools, social media, and other contexts. And I told you I've been persuaded by this, so here's what I'm doing. Here's what I'm going to try to do. So I'm co-convener these days of something called the World Government Research Network, which is not as crazy as it sounds. There are a lot of, it's something that actually grew up organically because so many sort of prominent international relations scholars were starting to talk about global government. They felt like they just could not talk about it anymore. So it's just a way to bring us all together and put some dialogue and hopefully advance the most rigorous debate possible. We're taking as our next campaign, trying to encourage debating societies, student debating societies in universities worldwide to take up the UNPA idea. So it would be this House supports a UNPA. One side would say yay, one side would say no, and they would see, which side actually wins out in these debating societies. We'll encourage instructors across the world, we've got a pretty good list now, to incorporate either simulation or just a little unit on the UNPA idea, because it's a nice idea for student debate, because at the end of it, they have to make a decision. And here's the decision I would offer to you. The decision for you is whether or not to sign your name on the petition, on the online petition, at the Campaign for UN Parliamentary Assembly. I would encourage you to Google their site, go to it, it's very professional. But on that site is a space where you can sign on as a supporter of the idea of the Campaign for the UN Parliamentary Assembly. So I'll leave that to you to decide whether that's good use of the something. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for that presentation. We have a few minutes for questions if we can. If that's all right, we have some breakout workshops coming up to further this discussion as well. We have a mic coming around. If you'd like to ask a question, just raise your hand and we'll get a mic to you. I probably wanted to kick us off, if I can, just with this, probably a bit of perspective from America. America is possibly one of those nations which takes a strong view towards any notion of world government. How do you see the nature of that narrative changing?
Well, again, I think a lot of it depends on who brings in the other. And a lot of it depends on how successful the case can be made. I think America is two countries. America is sort of this moderate, mildly internationalist country, and then sort of a cowboy country. There's that, we've got that vein in the culture there, which is why the guns were started there. And I think the moderates have won so far. If you look at a country that's willing to give the UN 20 to 22% of its budget, so I think it's not insignificant the support the U.S. does give for multilateral relations, but there are those challenges.
Yes, indeed. Raise your hand if you have a question. We'll get a microphone to you. Got one down the middle of the room. Yes.